Hello everybody. Today I just wanted to make a quick video. This is gonna be like a very quick one, I reckon, because very recently we did get a translated interview with Wuthering Waves' lead storywriter, and I think when I was reading through it, I thought there was actually quite a lot of like interesting stuff and things that was like revealed through it. So I figured today I'll just like quickly talk about this because we don't get something like this all the time, right? Last time Wuthering Waves did something like this, they kind of like talked about, for example, the artistic process and like sort of like the game design, and that was really interesting. But we haven't gotten really something like this where we talk with the lead story writer. And as someone, for example, who studied and is studying kind of like publishing, especially in kind of like formats like digital media, I think I'll kind of like sort of talk about it a little bit because, as I said before, tons of interesting stuff, right? So translation via ChatGPT, unfortunately, but it's okay. You kind of get the gist of it. All of this is kind of like by game look. So basically a lot of this is a bit of a summary basically over here. One thing I find kind of interesting and one thing you'll see throughout the course of the interview is that Goose, who is the lead story writer of Wuthering Waves and Kura Games, doesn't really speak about the story in terms of pipelines or standards, but more so in terms of like quantifying it as a feeling or resonance and something interesting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later because I feel like it is a bit more of kind of like a modern Eastern approach to art these days, to focus a lot more on sort of like the purpose, the feeling, the end product, rather than necessarily technique and execution. But we'll talk about that as kind of the interview progresses, right? So seeing players collectively go emo, I'm assuming the word here is really just kind of like depressed and kind of like get really sad. Your team's first reaction was really like very happy. And I think that, as we said before, as long as players could feel the emotion you wanted to convey, that was enough to make us happy, right? And I think that this, as I was talking about before, leads to a bit of an overarching sort of perspective in Eastern art at the moment, where you don't really focus on technique or the process, but more so the atmosphere, the feeling, and how you want your audience to kind of respond generally to what you're creating. And this isn't something that is exclusive to story writing, but also something that's very prominent in, for example, modern Chinese painting, right? But yeah, like the fact that, for example, they talk less about logic and more about feeling, right? What might players feel at this moment, I think is very indicative of sort of like, at least I think, Chinese artistic approaches at the moment. But yeah, guiding imagination through audiovisual language to connect foreshadowing through memory. And we're going to talk a little bit more about foreshadowing later on because there's actually a specific question about this. But yeah, characters' emotions and immersions, and they feel like it's the greatest affirmation of their work. I think a lot of you guys may have seen Solon's internal message to the team after 3.1, but they were also internally very happy with the outcome of it. So it goes back to aligning with feelings. Like, we won't talk about that excessively since we've already discussed it. But yeah, like, not just the writer's environment design, and environment design is incredibly important in Wuthering Waves. More so, I think, than even like other gacha games. And I might talk about that later on in another video, but like cinematics, voice acting, audiovisual presentation, text, everything is unified. And I think there's going to be another sort of like section afterwards where they talk about how Wuthering Waves as a story is a very strong joint effort between different departments, between different kind of like, for example, like areas of storytelling, like for example, 3D rendering and audio and music and stuff like that, right? It's all unified in a sense. So anyhow, players say 3.1 has a strong emotional aftershock. What's the core pain point of this knife? I think you guys generally get the gist of what this means. The core is resonance, right? And the carrier of that resonance is simplest emotion, family, right? And I won't kind of read through this whole thing, but essentially I find this very interesting in that, in line with their feeling-driven, atmosphere-driven approach to story, one of the reasons why internally they think 3.1 works so well was simply because it touched on something that was relatable to their audience, to their demographic. They touch upon a relatively universal human experience, right? Which is, as they say, family, right? And when players recognize their own understanding of family in Amyth, empathy naturally arises, right? So even though Amyth's story in 3.1 was definitely not a simple work, I think the undercurrent and the foundation of it was really precipitated on a rather simple kind of like execution, right? That empathy is kind of like the roots when you think of family for most people. And that's why, they stab the pain point, because it's relatable, right? It's a universal human experience that most people would have at least some experience with, right? So yeah. 3.1 contains heavy sci-fi elements. Hard sci-fi and being overly cryptic are only separated by a thin line. This is a very good point, right? One of the things that you will learn rather quickly if you are writing, for example, sci-fi and fantasy, is that one of the biggest issues is world building, right? And oftentimes, for example, being, as I say, cryptic, vague, and confusing. Because since you are creating a world which is substantially different from what the reader knows, it's not like contemporary fiction, right? You run into the issue where you have to create an authentic feeling world, something that's believable, but also at the same time, something that is understandable and not too overly confusing, right? Because if it's too confusing, then the reader can't really relate to it, and that begins to be a problem. And I think, in my opinion, Wuthering Waves suffered a lot from this issue, especially in 1.0, because Wuthering Waves is foundationally a sci-fi world that has very little relative kind of like similarity to our own. Like, for example, with Wuthering Waves in 1.0, like you play the game and then in 5 minutes you're told that like atoms don't exist, right? Or for example, the fact that Wuthering Waves is very heavily inspired by something like Dead Stranding. And that is like not a very understandable game, easy to understand game, right? So it has a sci-fi foundation, like classic themes, like all of that, and a grandmother paradox. So this was kind of like this idea of essentially the predestination paradox we're talking about, right? But essentially, I find it really interesting that they say we don't write the script like instruction manual. It's still really focused on amplifying emotional tension, right? So according to Goose, from what we're getting so far in this interview, I think this kind of emotion-based approach, this result-based approach on an ending or a result that is not just based on what literally happens, but on how you feel, is a very strong emphasis on the writing team internally, at least, right? They extracted the emotional core within the sci-fi concept. And I think that is something that is really difficult to do, especially within the sci-fi genre. But it seems to be their approach, and I think that can tell us probably a lot about the story. And as I said before, it is a trend among like wider Chinese artistic circles. So it's not something that personally I'm too surprised in their approach. So this is a very funny thing. So I see that some players have basically turned to Sherlock Rover, me, and a lot of like other theorists and lore tubers. And it's really nice to see they're very genuinely invested in how people are in the story. But of course, one thing's very interesting. Community interpretations of 3.1's future developments and the excavation of past details are very interesting, though some of them may have slightly gone off track. So I'm assuming that kind of means that the Chisa theory is not perhaps kind of like fully kind of like credible, perhaps. But it is like as I said before, like with the Chisa theory, I think a lot of people have asked me about what I think about it. In my view, I think that there is some evidence you could cite, like the things that people have talked about before, but it's not entirely credible, right? Analysis, theory, crafting, and whatnot are all rather subjective kind of like ways of thinking about certain parts of the story. But even within this realm of subjectivity, I think there needs to be a standard of proof. And personally, I don't think the Chisa theory, that Kuchiba Chisa, please save us, kind of like theory, has reached that bar of being something I can confidently say is valid, right? So I'm kind of shelving it. That's why I haven't really talked about the Chisa theory, because there's not enough evidence, in my opinion, that it is valid And I think when they say like it's slightly gone off track, that's kind of like what they mean, right? But yeah, anyhow, at least they feel everyone's enthusiasm. Like I would assume that like any kind of like story writing team would be interested in a lot of like the theory crafting that people are doing. So yeah, the reason it had to be them. How did you conceptualize Ameth? I find this very interesting, but it's not surprising to me. That Ameth is kind of basically a two-sided character, right? And I did kind of talk about this a lot in my Ameth video. If you guys haven't watched it before, I do recommend. It's a pretty good watch, in my opinion, at least. Ameth is split into her social identity as a school student and her resonance ability that makes her a digital ghost. And kind of like the savior of the world and whatnot. And there is kind of like a bit of a distinction between these two sides, which I think is rather evident from Ameth's character, especially if you do, for example, character design and story writing and whatnot. It's very obvious that Ameth is sort of centered along these two lines, right? You have, like, for example, other characters, particularly ones like Carter, right? Carter is a very similar kind of like has a very similar conceptual design language to Ameth, because they're both characters with two sides to them, right? With Ameth, for example, you have the student, and then you have the save the world as a digital ghost. With Carter, you have like the innocent young girl who wants to go on adventures, and then the jaded fleur-de-lis, right? And then with Carter, if you guys have watched my video on basically Don Quixote and stuff like that, the symbolic kind of like design of that character is also emblematic of that, right? Which is why, for example, Carter is kind of focused on the design language of Don Quixote, and then with fleur-de-lis, that's focused on Joan of Arc, right? Because both of them present you a very different perspective of the character. And with Ameth, it's kind of like the same, right? With Ameth, for example, you have like the student component was very focused on Dia Giovanni, which we talked about with the Ameth video. And the kind of the side of the digital ghost and kind of like the savior of the world was very heavily focused on, for example, more Abrahamic religious kind of connotations. So, for example, Ameth's name herself, Siglim, as well as also sort of like this Norse mythology with like Balder and Varunga, stuff like that. So this kind of idea that, you know, she has a social identity, student and singer, and her resonance side, the fantastical element of the digital ghost, is not surprising to me in the slightest, actually, because they've kind of done it already very clearly with Carter, right? From a character design perspective, it makes perfect sense. But it's very interesting that they kind of affirm, right, this dual-sided nature, because not every character is like this, right? Carter, of course, is a prime example of one that is, but you also have, for example, the story writers and the developers saying characters like Choyun, for example. Choyun is very heavily focused on a singular side of the wuxia, of, for example, the like Chinese poet, kind of like Tang Dynasty sort of like era, inspiration, stuff like that. It's very sort of like one-sided, right? But you have characters like Ameth and Carter who are split in two in regards to characterization. And I think that is a very interesting thing for them to confirm. Because sorry, I didn't actually, I completely forgot that they talked about Carter design. But it's basically what I just said. I hadn't read this part, actually. It's basically what they just said, right? Carter sort of like has a very similar dual design. But anyhow, right? After 3.1, Rover feels more three-dimensional. How do you shape them? So Goose, we've always treated Rover as the most important character, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory, because you're going on Rover's journey, right? They're roving, quite literally. But the world sort of like revolves around them because, as I said, Rover's the most important character. When designing their actions, we consider the player's perspective. If players feel anger at a turning point, Rover should act as well. So this is kind of this idea, I feel like, that Rover's amnesia and memory loss is almost used as a narrative technique to put the player and Rover on the same playing field. And what I mean by that is essentially that because Rover doesn't know anything, the reader, the audience, I'm approaching this like a story, the audience also is on a similar level where they don't know anything. So when Rover learns something new, the audience also learns something new, right? So essentially there is kind of like this merging of the protagonist and the audience, and that could, for example, be a little bit of kind of like an immersive technique. There's also growth. So, for example, rovers should change. When facing difficulties, they should solve them using accumulated experience and abilities. Again, this idea that rovers' journey, I feel like, should have a purpose. When they accumulate human experiences, they become more kind of like richer as a person, and they're able to sort of kind of like discuss and kind of like adapt to different situations more like better, right? Basically, as I say here, it should allow the protagonist and player to feel like they are growing. And Rover, of course, is a very sort of like debatable character. I have talked to a lot of people about it, and I'm probably not going to talk about it right here. But Rover being kind of like an empty slate is a good and a bad thing, right? As I said before, it could be a good thing, but at the same time, Rover not knowing a lot of things means that a lot of information has to be necessarily gatekept from the reader, and that can, for example, sort of distance them from the overarching holistic narrative that kind of encompasses Wuthering Waves. And I think they have kind of like improved that in 3.1 with a lot of like bomb drops, lore bombs dropped about Rover's past and whatnot in 3.1, but that can't be what every update is, right? So yeah, the line I want to say about everyone's side and move from the past tomorrow together. So basically, this is the Rover's idol line that they speak to Amos after Amos tells them the truth. And it wasn't like a preset golden line. We never decided a specific sentence must be spoken 3.1. I think that's a very good approach, right? The fact that, for example, something that you don't intend to even be like a sort of like a golden quote, let's just call it, becomes as such because of the audience's interpretation, I think is a very healthy thing when it comes to, for example, just compositions in general, because that means that essentially your audience is interpreting things perhaps differently from you, right? And one thing that you kind of learn within, for example, story writing is something called what is it called again? Reader-writer response theory. Yeah, that's what it's called. And basically that is kind of like this idea of how the message of a writer should kind of like be transported to the reader. And I think with a lot of like postmodernist and modern interpretations of the theory, we're leaning towards this idea that audiences should be able to kind of interpret what a story means by themselves, right? And I think that's also kind of like a approach I live by. It's kind of like this idea that there's actually a term for this. It's called the death of the author. You guys can search it up if you guys are interested. But that's why, for example, I don't really do a lot of lore videos where I tell you guys what happens in the story, because I want you guys to essentially interpret a story through your own lens, through your own experience. Because I do firmly believe that no two people can see the story in the exact same way, right? Because the way we interpret and understand stories is not just kind of like dependent on how we see the like literal words and the kind of like meaning or the purpose that the author had, but also it's colored by our own worldview, our experiences, right? So everyone's going to have a bit of a different way of looking at a story. And I think that this kind of idea that they never really supposed to kind of like they were never supposed to have a golden quote here is pretty interesting, I feel, because it kind of goes to show that sometimes, you know, when you are a creator, a writer, or an artist, sometimes the way the audience looks at your work can go beyond your expectations. And I think that's almost kind of like a bit of a beautiful thing in a way. So, better to be a vegetable farmer than a god. This is a really, really interesting question, because Goose, the writer of Wuthering Waves, compares the framework of Wuthering Waves to a vegetable garden, right? And I think this is one of the things that would make a lot more sense in Chinese, right? There's a lot of metaphors in Chinese that sound a lot better than English, let's just say. I think, for example, what they were saying here was like something like a metaphor like 种菜, right? This idea that, as they say here, there is every single patch and part of the stage of the story of Wuthering Waves presents you a specific set of different conditions, right? And when you want to cook, like not slang word cook, but like literally cook, Goose tells everyone what ingredients are available and how they might be used, right? And I think like a better metaphor in English would be like, for example, cooking dinner at home, right? Instead of, for example, kind of like deciding what you want to make for dinner and going outside to buy the ingredients at the grocery store, you look at what's in your fridge and you decide what to make based on the ingredients that you have. I think that's a better metaphor in terms of like the English language. But basically, what you can kind of get from that is that within Wuthering Waves, basically, I think Goose understands that every stage of the story has a set of, for example, limitations as well as available opportunities. And you craft a story based on what you have at hand, right? Not in terms of like the logistical department capabilities, but more so kind of like what's available to Rover, right? Because Rover starts off as a blank slate. So the people that they know, what they know about the world is limited. So what Rover can do is really dependent on where they are in the story currently. And I think the framework, it kind of guides direction. They trust in each department's kind of creativity, and we'll talk about that later. But the idea is that basically you craft a story, as we said before, around Rover, right? What's available to Rover needs to kind of also be like what the player has access to. You don't just say, for example, like, what's happening in New Federation right now? Because Rover doesn't know what's happening in New Federation. They don't even know what the New Federation really is, right? Nor they know, for example, what Lilyland is about. It's been mentioned, but they don't know, right? It's like, for example, how like, I think this is both a critique and kind of like a compliment, that a lot of Rover's story is about roving, right? They go with the flow of things. They kind of ebb and flow the waves, and we'll kind of talk about that a bit later because there's actually an interview section that talks about that. But it kind of like basically, instead of a preset story, right, where, for example, I was talking about this with someone yesterday, and this kind of idea that one thing that Wuthering Waves story kind of does is that it's very inconsistent in an authentic and natural way, right? I don't know if you guys have heard of this story. This was a rather famous fantasy series when I was a kid called Deltora Quest. And Deltora Quest was a fantasy series where, in order to save the world, basically a party of adventurers had to travel to 7 places. And those 7 places each had a single gem. So you went around collecting 7 gems, 7 books, going to one place to get a gem, and it's a very consistent and understandably structured narrative. But Wuthering Waves doesn't function like that, because Wuthering Waves, like the journey is about Rover roving, right? There's no preset structure to what happens in a story. Like, they don't know where they're going, and that could be a bad thing. I think a lot of people don't like that because there isn't sort of like a sense of like a holistic grander narrative, even though there very obviously exists one. We don't know where we're going next, and I think Rover doesn't really know either. Like, IMF kind of asked them, like, what are you going to do after this in 3.1? And Rover's just like, I don't know, kill the Frenodian or something. Like, I don't know, man. It's like they don't know themselves, right? And I think that that's kind of like both a good or a bad thing, because yes, it's less structured, but it's also kind of like more realistic and authentic in a way, because when you kind of work on this vegetable farmer kind of like structure of a journey, right, where you don't know where you're going next, you go with the flow, that's kind of like what life is, right? Like, life is very, very rarely a predetermined destiny. And I don't think Rover's journey is that either. So I'll let you guys think about, for example, how you feel about that, because I do agree it is a bad and a good thing, right? Depending on how you look at it. And judging by, for example, their metaphor here about the vegetable farmer, and as I said before, probably a better way to say in English would be like cooking with what you have in the fridge, right? This kind of approach to the story in regards to Rover's perspective is interesting, right? it's interesting. It's risky, but it can also pay off rather well. So yeah, let's go on to the next part. Players are amazing at production plays. Do you have a precise workflow? Our logic is align feelings first and then let everyone excel in their specialty, right? This is a very interesting point because one thing I've kind of talked about quite a lot is that Wuthering Waves, in my opinion, I would say does not have the best story, right? Of an RPG game. Let's talk about RPGs because I feel like Wuthering Waves is really more of an RPG game at this point, to me at least, than a gacha game, right? Wuthering Waves does not have the best story of an RPG game. Let's kind of place that on the table straight off the bat, right? But in the frame of a gacha RPG live service game, I do think they have the best story if you keep that relative to what the level of quality that they're putting into 3D rendering and music and stuff like that, right? Like, for example, if you compare, like, is Wuthering Waves' story better than, like, Umineko? Like, no, right? But that's not a fair comparison because Wuthering Waves is an Unreal Engine game rendered in 3D with excellent music, and Umineko is a slideshow of music, right? It's not really fair. And I don't think, for example, it's even fair to compare, like, Wuthering Waves' story to even something like Nikke, right? Because the presentation is significantly different, and as such, the logistical reality is in another world, right? I remember, actually, when I was kind of like reading through Arknight's Enfield, there was a very interesting interview that they also had with Arknight's Enfield's lead story director. And one of the things I remember a lot about that is that when they were creating Arknight's Enfield story, one of the biggest problems was literally word count, right? They could only shove about 20,000 words of story into a patch because beyond, if you went more than that, then you reach the upper cap of like logistical kind of like capability in terms of, for example, co-working with other departments, like for example the 3D rendering kind of like department. I don't know what it's called, right? I'm not an expert on that. As well as also like the music department, stuff like that. There's so many different components of like a story that has to go into, for example, you know, like Wuthering Waves as a game. When you go to a main story patch, there's so many different things. Which is why, for example, by the way, Wuthering Waves' lore is, in my opinion, basically 50-50 the main story quest, and then the other 50% is like world lore, like talking to NPCs, reading extracts and like logs and stuff like that. That's where the other half of the lore is, right? But in terms of main story quests, because there's so much of a focus placed on them, you need to let, as they say here, everyone excel at their specialty. And as we said before, they have a very feelings-first approach. But the production pace of all of this stuff kind of like, you know, is dependent on so many different things like art, level design, cinematics, and audio, right? And they all have to collaborate together to form one united and finished product, right? It's completely different from something like, for example, Umineko, where, or like even like I can even say like PGR, right? Where you can basically tell much more of a story literally and metaphorically because of the constraints of the level design and the art and the cinematics that we're talking about here that Wuthering Waves does not have, right? You can't, for example, tell a 40,000 word story within a main story, like within, for example, you know, like let's just say like 3.0.2 or something, like Act 2 or 3.0, and basically be able to kind of like manage all the 3D rendered scenes and the music for that, for example, and release that in 42 days, right? It's just not a logistical reality. And that's why I say I think Wuthering Waves, relatively speaking, if you consider the level of 3D rendering and the music and the cinematics and everything else they're doing, they probably have the best story of a gacha live service game. Because relatively speaking, as I said before, it's not fair to compare it to something like Umineko, right? Or like a visual novel, you know, or like any other kind of like gacha game that presents a story within a visual novel format, because the logistical reality is just completely different. But yeah, like this idea, like as I said before, that within Wuthering Waves, I think we kind of knew this already from previous interviews, but all of the departments are very unified, and they have to be, because their storytelling approach is so dependent on this kind of like cross collaboration between disciplines and departments, right? Like a rolling snowball, creativity grows bigger and bigger. Are you worried about retcons as the story expands? If you guys don't know what a retcon is basically when, in order to fit, kind of like plug up or fix a plot hole in a story, you go back and change something that happened in the story before in order to make everything make sense. And it's usually seen as a bad thing because you do a retcon if you can't keep your story consistent. And if you are concerned about that, Goose says we have a look ahead and look back philosophy, which basically just means that essentially they place a lot of emphasis on a holistic narrative and foreshadowing, right? They're not going to be doing a lot of retcons because they plan all the arcs long term. And we notice already because I think in another interview they said that they work on like 3 patches at the same time, right? The team at Kuro works on 3 patches at the same time. So they have a rather sophisticated understanding of what they want to do long term, right? And what they do instead of kind of like, for example, trying to keep everything kind of like consistent like in the future. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Instead of kind of like just doing things in the moment and then thinking about keeping consistent later on, they keep it consistent first. And in order to keep it consistent, they keep on looking back and thinking about what they could use as a hook from foreshadowing, right? So basically, I think they can actually kind of like phrase it better than I can. When planning long-term arcs, we ask, are there earlier plot hooks we can echo? Are there details that once seemed incidental that can now flourish? So this idea that when they're planning kind of stories, they go back to earlier stories and see that like, is there anything that we can kind of like turn into a massive foreshadowing moment? Like, for example, like for this patch, maybe it was kind of this idea of like the golden quote, right? This idea of like, what was it? The idea of, somewhere over here, kind of like kind of how I can't find it anymore. But like the golden quote about like Rover's idol line. Yeah, this one. I want to say by everyone's side and move from the past into tomorrow together. That kind of idea, like that is an example of what they just talked about, right? Within, for example, the look ahead and look back philosophy. Okay, let's go on to the next part. What is the tonal foundation of Wuthering Waves? And I love this part. Because a lot of people are kind of like asking, right, what's the point of Wuthering Waves? Like, what is the lesson that they're trying to kind of like present? What is the holistic message? And I think I would very much understand if that wasn't clear. But our slogan, Goose says, is the best. Waves echo and return. Civilization remains unyielding. This idea that no matter how much trouble is faced by kind of like humanity will persevere, right? And this is a quote which I think, symbolically speaking, makes a lot more sense in Chinese, right? And I'll explain kind of like why it is. Because in Chinese, there's a lot of poems, like for example, by Du Fu and stuff like that, which talk about rivers, right? Rivers as sort of like a passage of time, as a metaphor for a passage of time. So there's a lot of poems in Chinese that talk about, for example, like waves and like kind of like rivers flowing, waves beating on the shore as kind of like the constant like ebb and flow, the constant battering and like, receding of humanity's troubles, right? And you can probably imagine, for example, because China has a river which is perfect for this metaphor, the Yangtze, right? This makes a lot of sense within sort of like an Eastern perspective. Bodies of water are like emblematic of humanity and history. And this idea of wuthering waves is literally this idea of like waves that ebb and flow, that recede and surge up, right? And that's kind of like the heartbeat of humanity in a sense. I don't know if that kind of like metaphorically translated well into English, but that's kind of like what it is, right? This idea that no matter like, even if we're kind of like through the ebb and flow of history, civilization continues to persevere, right? Whether that resonance is joy, sorrow, tragedy, or exhilaration, as long as players feel that unyielding core, we've achieved our goal. Again, this idea that humanity will persevere, right? It's just like very simple, but it's not so obvious when you go into Wuthering Waves is kind of like story and whatnot. But this is kind of like what I'm saying with like, as I said, if you guys recall what I just said with Rover, right? Their journey is about roving, right? There is no predetermined destiny. There is no fate. In fact, Wuthering Waves seems to very much dislike the concept of a fate because so many characters fight back against fate, right? There is no predetermined destiny. There is no like mission where you have to find 7 gems to save the world, right? It's the ebb and flow of the waves. It's about a life which is inconsistent. You don't know what's going to happen, but that's what life is, right? And I think that's kind of like, there's almost something very poetic and beautiful in that. And I mean, it is poetic. It's based on Chinese poetry, but like, it's kind of like, you guys know what I mean, right? It's like, you know, that's kind of like how it is. Like life is like that. It's not consistent. It's not a predetermined destiny. And I think that like people at Kuro think that life, that's what life should be as well. Like you shouldn't be shackled by fate. You shouldn't be shackled by a destiny that you haven't decided on your own. That's a kind of like this sort of design language that has been used excessively within Wuthering Waves' story. So yeah, this is another interesting one. What fundamentally distinguishes game narrative from films or novels? And this is something I learned a lot in university and throughout my studies, right? Is storytelling through different mediums. Game narrative is very interesting. I think Goose's response, I find, is very insightful, right? Goose thinks that what, for example, especially differentiates the story of a game narrative and a film is the progress bar, right? The idea that you can't skip the ending. In games, the story only advances when the players actively push it forward. Every action carries meaning and experience. And there's 2 things I want to talk about this, right? Sorry. Is, first off, this idea of immersion, right? Video game stories provide a level of immersion that is not attainable within film. That's a very kind of like obvious point, rather, because you're controlling characters, right? And the second thing I think is kind of this idea that I think Goose and like the people at Kuro have an idea of like, again, this quote, that life is not meant to be consistent, right? You ebb and flow with the waves. And when it comes to, for example, progress, right, you can't skip the ending of Wuthering Waves. Like, you don't know how the story is going to end. Rover doesn't know how the story is going to end. None of the people in Solaris 3 know how the lament is going to end. It's a mystery, right? And I think that unknowingness is both a fear of the people, right? That makes it kind of like authentic and sort of like true to life in a sense, but also perhaps for some others, a weakness because they feel like the story doesn't feel holistic. And even though we know it's a rather grand planned story, we can't see a lot of it. Like a lot of the information is being gatekept, right? But I think their approach to this is that, yes, the information is being gatekept, but we don't want to tell you guys everything. We want you guys to explore, to feel, for Rover to literally rove, right? That's the point of the game. And if you look at it that way, I think you can kind of like really understand the approach that the writing team is taking, because you have, for example, like a lot of like patch. I feel like the whole Renacida patch is like a good example in roving, right? Rover roves. They build up human experiences. They experience life as it is, not some predetermined destiny. And the story only advancing when players actively push it forward, I think that kind of like, you know, is really true for Wuthering Waves, because as we said before, Rover as a literary device, being like amnesiac and not knowing their memories, recovering their memories, is on the same playing field as a player who goes into story not really knowing anything. There is a sort of association that I feel like Kuro is trying to make between Rover and the player. It's not, for example, a character you're playing who knows more than you, or like within, for example, Wuthering Waves, not even a lot of dramatic irony is used throughout the story. Like, if Rover knows something, chances are you know them, right? Besides, for example, maybe a trailer or like a small scene where you see like Cristoforo yapping about something and Rover doesn't see it. There's not a lot of scenes like that, right? And even then, if there are, it's not very important. But there is a very heavy connection with what the rover knows and the player knows, right? It's very much kind of like third person limited kind of narration. So yeah. Does that change how narrative quality is judged? Goose says, yes, if players actively participate, we must ask, is their effort meaningful, right? So I think this is rather simple, this idea that basically players need to feel like their actions have weight, right? Good storytelling aligns play experience with developer guidance. So yeah. After setting such a high bar in 3.1, how will future versions be planned? This is really interesting. We use a wave-like rhythm for long-term storytelling. Some versions are calmer transitions, others heighten emotional intensity. And this is something that I've been saying for a very long time. I talked about this a lot within 2.8 because a lot of people felt like 2.8 was disappointing. But I felt 2.8 was okay, right? It wasn't like amazing story, but it was sort of like the calm after the storm, right? You just saved the world in 2.7, you need to relax a little bit. And it's good to see that kind of like Goose is basically affirming how I see the story, in that not every single patch can be like an earth-shattering revelation. Like, in simple, like kind of like anime terms, I guess you could say, there needs to be some patches which are kind of slightly just filler, so you don't kind of like burn out of passion, right? We don't want players to burn out their passion in one version. We aim for sustained anticipation. I think that's a very logical approach for game development and long-term development, especially because Wuthering Waves has such a large kind of like bigger than me kind of like storytelling approach to the world, that they can't just pull off all the bars right off in one patch, right? They're kind of like, they're drip feeding you, yes, but at the same time, I think for a live service game, that is a logistical and narrative reality that you have to kind of like understand in a sense, right? So yeah, what label do you hope Wuthering Waves leaves in players' minds? Long-term growth. That's very good to see because, as we said before, they have a very long story and a plan, right? They plan the stories multiple patches in advance. They work on multiple patches at once, right? And this idea that basically they want to try new things, they're looking to improve, and they have improved, right? We definitely know they have improved, especially from 1.0, from 1.2, even from 2.x. They've improved substantially, right? That is very good to see, and they have a long-term story, but they want to also keep it sort of like a little bit inconsistent, right? A little bit kind of like unpredictable, because the point of Rover's journey is to rove, right? And they're going to find out more about life, more about the details of the world through the incidental adventures. And I think that's kind of like the approach they're taking. But anyhow, this was basically the end of the interview. I found this a very sort of like insightful, really interesting kind of like interview, because it's the first time we've directly interviewed the lead story writer, right? We've seen, for example, the interview with the music producer and kind of like, I think, the gameplay designer. We haven't seen the lead story writer. So just thought I'd kind of like talk about this in a video. Hope you guys kind of like enjoyed me yapping a little bit and sort of like, I guess, a podcast style, I suppose, because I'm not going to be putting any editing on this. But yeah, I'll be kind of like churning out some extra videos later on. I want to talk a little bit about Lahiroy's Sentinel. But anyhow, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day. And I'll see you guys in the next video.